There's a special kind of silence that fills suburban streets at night, the sort that only breaks when something goes terribly wrong. On the edge of a cul-de-sac lined with identical beige homes and freshly trimmed lawns, that silence was shattered one summer night at exactly 3:07 a.m. The homeowner, let's call him Ethan, wasn't expecting company. He had gone to bed late, still frustrated after another tense HOA meeting where board members debated the visual consistency of backyard fences. Ethan's wooden fence, slightly taller than the regulation height by maybe 6 inches, had become their favorite topic. They said it disrupted the flow of the neighborhood. He said it kept his rescue dog safe. When the distant rumble of an engine woke him, it took a few seconds to register that it wasn't a passing truck. The sound was too close, too deliberate. Then came the scraping, the dull crack of wood being torn from the earth. By the time he reached his back window, floodlights from a utility truck illuminated the scene. 2 men in reflective vests, operating a small bulldozer, tearing through his fence like it was cardboard. The HOA logo was visible on the side of the truck. For a moment, Ethan thought he must be dreaming. No notice, no warning, just destruction. His privacy gone in an instant. The garden lights he'd installed were crushed beneath the treads. The dog barked wildly, racing along the line where the fence had stood just moments before. And there, standing proudly beside the machine, clipboard in hand, was the HOA president herself, Mrs. Calloway. Mrs. Calloway, the kind of woman who carried a tape measure in her purse and believed that rules existed to be worshipped. She had been the loudest critic of Ethan's fence since the day it went up. To her, it represented defiance, a challenge to her carefully curated vision of suburban perfection. By the time Ethan reached the backyard, they were loading the splintered remains of the fence into the truck bed. He shouted, but they ignored him. The bulldozer rolled away, leaving behind churned-up soil, broken boards, and a stunned homeowner in his slippers. The truck's taillights disappeared down the street, red and cruel against the dark. That night, sleep never returned. The next morning, Ethan documented everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. The destroyed fence wasn't just an eyesore, it was evidence. He filed a complaint, but the HOA's response came swiftly. Your fence was in violation of height restrictions and had not been approved by the architectural committee. The board took necessary corrective action. Necessary corrective action. That phrase echoed in his head all day. They had trespassed on his property, destroyed his personal structure, but somehow they were calling it necessary. When he reached out to local authorities, they said it was a civil matter. The HOA's lawyers had already framed it as a rule enforcement, not vandalism. The board had all the power, or so they thought. Over the next few days, Ethan became an outcast in his own neighborhood. Some residents whispered apologies when he passed by. Others crossed the street to avoid him. Mrs. Calloway spread rumors that he'd been aggressive and uncooperative. She painted herself as the victim of his defiance. But Ethan wasn't angry anymore. He was calculating. Every night, he sat on his back porch staring at the spot where the fence used to be. His dog lay beside him, restless without the barrier that once marked their space. From that vantage point, he could see directly into the HOA's meeting room across the cul-de-sac, a converted garage where board members gathered twice a week. He noticed how often they met, how late they stayed, and how smugly they left afterward. That's when the idea came. IT started small. A sketch on a napkin, a few online searches about property rights, construction permits, and HOA restrictions. Then came the plan. If they wanted to tear down what was his, he would build something they couldn't ignore. Something that stood above every fence, hedge, and rule in the neighborhood. He called it Project Lookout. At first, it was just a platform built around the massive oak tree at the corner of his yard. A tree that was technically on his property and, crucially, exempt from the HOA's reach. But the platform grew. Soon it had railings, then walls, a roof, solar lights, a ladder that wound upward like a spine of defiance. Every plank was nailed with quiet precision, each strike of the hammer echoing like a declaration. Neighbors noticed, of course. Some were curious, others nervous. Mrs. Calloway sent 2 violation notices before the structure was even half finished, claiming it was an unapproved addition. But the bylaws were clear. Tree houses under a certain size didn't require HOA approval. And Ethan had measured everything down to the inch. By the end of the second week, the Treehouse HQ stood tall and proud. It overlooked the cul-de-sac perfectly, giving Ethan a panoramic view of every driveway, every mailbox, and most importantly, the HOA office. From his perch, he installed motion lights and small security cameras, legally positioned within his property line. He wasn't breaking rules. He was following them better than they ever did. The first night he climbed up and looked out, the air felt different, lighter, freer. The wind brushed through the oak leaves, and for the first time since the demolition, he felt a sense of control returning. Down below, Mrs. Calloway's car idled near his curb before speeding off. She had seen it. The battle lines were drawn. Over the next few days, Ethan began noticing small changes. The HOA sent letters about light pollution, then about privacy concerns, then, unbelievably, about visual obstruction. It was clear they were desperate to find a way to dismantle the treehouse. But Ethan had anticipated every move. His permits were filed, his documentation airtight. Every attempt they made only strengthened his case. And as night fell, neighbors started visiting. Quietly at first, one or two at a time. Curious to see the treehouse tower. They shared their own stories of fines, harassment, and unfair treatment from the HOA. Some even offered help. Solar panels, spare lumber, old binoculars. The Treehouse HQ became more than a structure. It became a symbol, a place where residents could meet without fear of HOA reprisal. From his elevated perch, Ethan began collecting stories, signatures, and evidence. By the end of the month, the same HOA that had destroyed his fence now faced something they couldn't bulldoze. A growing movement, and in the middle of it all, Mrs. Calloway was fuming. The treehouse stood tall, bathed in the golden glow of its new floodlights, visible from every corner of the street. It was no longer just a backyard project. It was a declaration of independence, one that dared the HOA to make their next move. And they would. They always did. The treehouse changed everything. For the first time in years, the quiet suburb didn't revolve around the HOA. It revolved around the man who had dared to defy them, Ethan, sitting in his wooden fortress high above the neighborhood, watching over the cul-de-sac like a silent sentry. His Treehouse HQ became a local legend in a matter of days. It started with whispers. Parents walking their kids to school would glance at it and smile. Joggers would pause to take pictures. Even delivery drivers slowed down just to get a better look. The structure stood taller than any fence, any hedge, any sign the HOA had ever erected. It was both rebellious and beautiful, a wooden crown on the neighborhood's manicured head. But while neighbors admired it, the HOA board saw something else entirely. Insubordination. Mrs. Calloway, the HOA president, called an emergency board meeting within 24 hours of its completion. She labeled the treehouse a blight on the community aesthetic and a potential safety hazard. Her tone, cold and authoritative, carried the weight of a woman who was used to getting her way. But this time, she didn't have unanimous support. Some of the board members, especially those who had quietly visited Ethan's HQ, hesitated. They had seen how well built it was, how it didn't violate a single clear rule. Still, fear of crossing Mrs. Calloway kept them mostly silent. The HOA began its counterattack in stages. First came the letters. Long, condescending paragraphs accusing Ethan of everything from encouraging gatherings without authorization to disturbing the neighborhood's peace. The envelopes arrived daily, each stamped with the HOA's emblem like a personal insult. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he pinned each letter to a corkboard in his treehouse, his wall of injustice. Then came the fines. Point 1 for unauthorized lighting, another for inappropriate structure elevation. Then one that simply read, Community Uniformity Violation, $500. The charges piled up like leaves in autumn, absurd and desperate. Ethan paid none of them. Instead, he began forwarding every piece of correspondence to a property lawyer he'd quietly hired after the fence incident. What Mrs. Calloway didn't know was that Ethan's lawyer had found something interesting. The HOA's original charter, the document granting them enforcement authority, was missing a renewal signature from several years prior. In legal terms, that meant their power to issue fines or conduct corrective actions was questionable at best. Still, Ethan didn't reveal his ace just yet. He let them dig deeper. While the HOA flailed in paperwork and threats, Ethan kept building. Not upward this time, but outward, stringing solar-powered string lights from the branches, installing a small wind turbine for power, and adding a sign near the base of the oak that read, Treehouse HQ Neighborhood Watch. That last detail drove Mrs. Calloway wild. She called it an unauthorized vigilante initiative. But the neighbors loved it. In the weeks since the demolition of his fence, petty thefts and late-night disturbances had mysteriously vanished. People felt safer knowing someone was awake and watching. Ethan didn't patrol or interfere. He simply observed. When porch lights flicked on at odd hours or suspicious cars cruised the cul-de-sac, he made notes and shared them on the neighborhood forum. Politely, professionally, without naming names. Each post ended with the same closing line, just keeping an eye out for all of us. The community rallied behind him. When the HOA announced a special assessment fee to cover legal costs, homeowners finally snapped. Over half the neighborhood refused to pay. Whispers turned into meetings, and meetings turned into petitions. Someone even started a social media page, Save Our Street Down with the HOA. Within a week, it had hundreds of followers, complete with photos of Ethan's treehouse and stories from residents who'd been fined for ridiculous reasons. The HOA's grip was slipping, and Mrs. Calloway knew it one night. As Ethan sat in his treehouse under the soft hum of the wind turbine, his cameras caught something strange. A black SUV pulled up near his property. The driver, hooded and cautious, stepped out and began tampering with one of the motion lights. The moment the figure looked up, the cameras caught their face. It was Mrs. Calloway. The next morning, Ethan printed the footage and delivered it, courteously, to the local police department. Not as an accusation, but as a concerned citizen's report. He didn't even mention the HOA. The footage spoke for itself. Within days, word spread that the HOA president was under investigation for trespassing and property tampering. She denied everything, of course, but the damage was done. The board began fracturing. Members resigned quietly, unwilling to be dragged into the scandal. Yet Mrs. Calloway wasn't finished. Humiliated and furious, she launched her most aggressive move yet. The HOA filed a lawsuit against Ethan, claiming his treehouse was an unauthorized structure exceeding height limitations and compromising neighborhood safety. They demanded its removal within 10 days and payment of all back fines. Ethan expected this. In fact, he had been waiting for it. He gathered every photograph, every letter, every time-stamped video. From the bulldozed fence to the harassment to the unauthorized demolition at 3 a.m. His lawyer compiled it all into a counterclaim for property damage, emotional distress, and abuse of power. When the lawsuit reached the courthouse, the HOA expected silence. What they got was a full-blown counterattack. Ethan's documentation was immaculate. The police report of the Midnight Demolition, the footage of the president trespassing, the missing renewal signature in their charter. All of it came crashing down like a wave. The judge called for a preliminary hearing. The HOA board panicked. Homeowners filled the gallery, whispering as Ethan calmly sat in the front row, composed, confident. The hearing didn't end in a verdict, but something far more damaging for Mrs. Calloway. An injunction preventing the HOA from taking any enforcement action until their charter validity could be reviewed. For the first time, the HOA was powerless. That night, the cul-de-sac was alive with quiet celebration. Neighbors stopped by Ethan's yard, leaving baked goods and notes of support. The Treehouse HQ was decorated with string lights and handmade banners. What had started as one-man stand had become a neighborhood revolution. But deep down, Ethan knew the war wasn't over. Mrs. Calloway might have lost control of the board, but people like her didn't give up. They plotted, and sure enough, as midnight crept over the silent houses once more, a faint glow appeared down the street. A moving truck. A man in uniform. Something was happening again under the cover of darkness. Ethan adjusted his camera feed from the treehouse, eyes narrowing as he zoomed in. It seemed the HOA had one last card to play. The moving truck parked at the far end of the cul-de-sac just after midnight. No headlights, no sound but the quiet click of the driver's door. Ethan watched from the treehouse, his cameras already recording. The faint light from his solar lamps bathed the oak branches in a pale glow, while below, the truck's rear door slid open to reveal something unexpected. Construction equipment. 3 men stepped out. Not residents, not city workers. They moved quickly, pulling out tools, marking the ground near the HOA's office, a converted garage across from Ethan's property. Within minutes, it was clear what they were doing. They weren't there to fix anything. They were there to remove something. The sign that read Maple Creek Homeowners Association was being unscrewed from the wall. Beneath it, boxes of documents and file cabinets were being loaded into the truck. It was a quiet exodus, a desperate attempt to erase evidence before the legal review of their charter could begin. Ethan zoomed in on the camera feed and smiled grimly. It was the final nail in their own coffin. By dawn, the truck was gone. But it didn't matter. Ethan had captured everything: faces, license plates, timestamps. The footage went straight to his lawyer, who forwarded it to the judge overseeing the injunction. Within hours, a court order froze the HOA's assets and demanded a full audit of their operations. The board was finished before sunrise. News spread faster than wildfire. Local reporters picked up the story. Homeowner fights back after HOA bulldozes fence. And soon the cul-de-sac that once feared the HOA became the epicenter of a scandal that spilled far beyond Maple Creek. Ethan stayed quiet. He didn't gloat. He didn't speak to cameras. He just kept climbing up to the treehouse each morning, coffee in hand, watching as the community he'd lived in for years began to change around him. Within a week, Mrs. Calloway was forced to resign. The trespassing investigation, the missing signature on the HOA charter, and now the midnight document removal, all of it had painted her as a power-hungry manipulator. Her carefully built image crumbled overnight. The same neighbors who once nodded obediently at her meetings now turned away when she passed. When the board disbanded temporarily, the neighborhood entered a strange kind of peace. No more fines, no more notices, no more fear of mailbox colors or lawn measurements. People began repainting their homes the colors they actually liked. Kids played in driveways without being scolded. Porch lights stayed on a little later. And at the center of it all, the Treehouse HQ stood as a monument to quiet resistance. Ethan used the space not as a lookout anymore, but as a community hub. He installed a small projector and once a week hosted movie nights for the neighborhood. Families brought blankets and snacks, kids climbed up to help turn on the lights, and laughter replaced the cold silence that used to hang over Maple Creek. But not everyone was ready to move on. A few weeks later, as the legal dust began to settle, Ethan received a certified letter. Not from the HOA, but from Mrs. Calloway herself. The tone was venomous, personal. She accused him of public humiliation, of destroying years of community order. She claimed she had done what was necessary to preserve standards. It was the last desperate gasp of a defeated tyrant. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he folded the letter neatly and pinned it next to the others on his wall of injustice in the treehouse. A final reminder of how power, when unchecked, can rot even the most ordinary neighborhood. Days turned into weeks, and the court eventually ruled in Ethan's favor. The HOA was ordered to compensate him for the illegal demolition of his fence and for emotional damages. The figure wasn't enormous, but the victory was. With the settlement, Ethan rebuilt the fence, stronger, higher, perfectly within the new regulations drafted by a newly elected homeowners committee. This time, the committee was chosen by popular vote. Real homeowners, real voices, people who actually cared about their neighbors instead of controlling them. Ethan declined when they offered him the chair position. He said he'd rather stay in the treehouse where he could keep an eye on things, just in case history tried to repeat itself. Under his quiet watch, Maple Creek became something it hadn't been in years: free. The new committee used the HOA funds for repairs, landscaping, and a small park near the end of the street. They scrapped the endless fines and replaced them with volunteer programs. Kids painted mailboxes, retirees planted gardens, and for the first time, Mrs. Calloway's name was never mentioned again. But fate, it seemed, had one last twist point one evening. Months later, Ethan climbed into the treehouse just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. The air was warm and calm, cicadas humming in the distance. From his vantage point, he noticed a new car parked in the driveway of the old HOA office. A moving van, unloading boxes. A new family had bought the property. A woman stepped out. A different face, younger, cheerful, and waved up at him when she saw him in the treehouse. She called out something he couldn't hear, but the tone was friendly. Her kids pointed at the structure, eyes wide with curiosity. She gestured with a smile that clearly asked if they could come take a look. Ethan nodded. Within minutes, the kids were climbing up the ladder, laughing and exploring the little lookout room. The mother looked around the neighborhood and said something to a neighbor that made everyone laugh. The atmosphere was light, easy, what suburban life was supposed to be. As the sun dipped lower, Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the lights flicker on across Maple Creek. The fences glowed with the soft amber of evening, his rebuilt one standing proudly among them. The Treehouse HQ, once a symbol of rebellion, was now a beacon of peace. Ethan thought back to that night, the roar of the bulldozer, the crash of wood, the helpless rage, and realized something strange. If they hadn't torn down that fence, if they hadn't pushed him so far, none of this would have changed. The neighborhood would still be living under fear of fines and petty power. Sometimes, he thought, you need something to be destroyed before something better can be built. Below him, the new family's laughter carried through the air. The neighborhood was alive again. No rules. No threats. Just people living side by side, finally free from the tyranny of control. As night fell, Ethan switched on the soft solar lights strung across the branches, illuminating the oak like a quiet guardian watching over Maple Creek. He took a sip of coffee and smiled as the stars came out. The battle was over, and the watchtower he'd built from defiance had become the heart of a community reborn.